The room trembled with silence the moment his voice struck, sharp, merciless, echoing off walls lined with polished cedar and cold glass. The Millionaire CEO had spoken, and in his words, he left no mercy. But what no one expected was that the breaking point of this story would not come from power, money, or authority. It would come from the gentle, trembling words of a little girl who dared to speak where grown men kept quiet. This is a story about humiliation, innocence, and the hidden ways God works through the least expected voices. It will move through boardrooms and battles of pride until one fragile moment of honesty brings an entire room to tears. Before we begin this journey, I invite you to subscribe so you don't miss a single chapter of this powerful testimony. And as you read, let your heart stay open, because sometimes the smallest voices carry the loudest truths. The elevator doors slid open with a hiss, releasing a faint smell of polished steel and burnt coffee from the lobby below. Lucas Ramirez adjusted the cuff of his worn grey shirt, a garment that once held color but now spoke of too many wash cycles and too little money. His palms sweated as he stepped into the 45th floor boardroom, where wealth had its own scent, cedar wood paneling infused with expensive cologne, and the faint leather of chairs imported from Italy. Morning sunlight poured through the glass walls, cutting across the long mahogany table like blades of gold. Here, under this light, power didn't need to speak. It was already felt. But it did speak, and when it spoke, it struck like thunder. At the head of the table sat Ethan Cole, 52 years old, silver hair slicked back with precision, tailored navy suit pressed to perfection. His piercing blue eyes scanned the room with the precision of a hawk circling prey. Even the way he tapped a Mont Blanc pen against the folder before him carried weight. Conversations hushed, backs straightened, and men who were leaders in their own homes suddenly looked like schoolboys waiting for a verdict. Ethan's reputation had traveled far beyond this glass tower. He was ruthless, calculated, and allergic to weakness. To him, failure was not a learning step, but a scarlet letter branded across a man's forehead. Lucas swallowed hard, lowering his gaze. The numbers on his last project hadn't matched expectations. He knew what was coming. He had seen colleagues shredded not with knives, but with words sharper than any blade. His chest tightened as he tried to breathe through the sterile, air-conditioned chill. His mind raced. How would he explain the shortfall? Should he speak about the late nights, the sacrifices, the hours stolen from his daughter's bedtime stories? But in this room, stories were worthless. Only results mattered, and results had failed him. The sound came suddenly, a clap of hands against the table, crisp and cutting. Ethan leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Lucas. "Do you know what incompetence looks like, Mr. Ramirez?" His voice was deep, cold, laced with disdain. It wasn't a question, it was a sentence. Every man in the room turned toward Lucas, their faces a mix of sympathy and relief. Sympathy because they knew humiliation was unbearable. Relief because, for today, it wasn't them. Lucas felt heat rush to his face, his throat locking tight as if invisible hands pressed against it. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The seconds stretched into eternity. Ethan's voice, calm yet merciless, broke the silence again. "This company is not a charity. If you want charity, go to the church on 5th Avenue. Here, we deal in results, numbers, proof, and you, Mr. Ramirez, have brought nothing but excuses." The words sliced the air like icy wind on bare skin. Lucas lowered his head, shame crawling over him like a heavy cloak. He thought of Sophia, his daughter's hazel eyes, the way her tiny arms wrapped around his neck every morning, whispering, "You're my hero, Papa." Would she still call him a hero if she saw him like this, small, cornered, stripped of dignity? Lucas clenched his fists under the table. His nails dug into his palms, grounding him. He wanted to defend himself, to remind Ethan and everyone else that behind these numbers was a man who worked tirelessly, a father who fought battles unseen. But pride had no place here. He remained silent, the weight of the room pressing down. the golden light through the windows now feeling harsh, almost accusatory. Somewhere outside, far below, the city roared with life, horns, voices, footsteps. But here, inside this glass tower, all Lucas heard was his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Then it happened. The boardroom door creaked open. The polished brass handle turned slowly, releasing a whisper of sound that sliced through the tension. Heads turned in unison, brows furrowed. Who would dare interrupt Ethan Cole in the middle of his courtroom? The air shifted, uneasy, as the shadow of a smaller figure stretched across the floor. Lucas's breath caught in his throat the moment he recognized the silhouette. Small shoes, a lilac dress, and hair that shimmered chestnut under the sunlit glass. His daughter, Sophia, had stepped into the lion's den, and as her innocent eyes scanned the room, silence fell heavier than any judgment Ethan Cole could pronounce. The polished oak door clicked shut behind her, and the sudden intrusion of such a small presence in such a colossal room felt almost surreal. The boardroom, designed for power plays and financial conquests, now held something it had never known: the fragile steps of an 8-year-old child. Sophia's shoes tapped lightly against the marble floor, echoing louder than they should have, each step tugging at Lucas's heart like a thread, unraveling his composure. Her lilac dress swayed gently, catching the golden light spilling from the vast windows, and her long chestnut hair shimmered like a halo, giving her an aura that seemed out of place among steel pens, glass walls, and hard faces. Lucas's chest tightened with both fear and awe. He wanted to rise, to shield her, to usher her out before Ethan Cole's sharp gaze could cut her down. But he couldn't move. His legs felt anchored, and his voice trapped beneath the weight of humiliation. Sophia looked at him with those hazel eyes untouched by greed, fear, or ambition, and Lucas felt both exposed and strangely comforted. Her presence reminded him of the world outside this tower of glass. Bedtime stories, morning hugs, the scent of pancakes on Saturdays, a world where he wasn't a failure but simply Papa. Ethan Cole's eyes narrowed, a flicker of annoyance flashing like lightning behind his composed exterior. "Who let this child in here?" His voice was low, steady, and dangerous, the kind of voice that preceded storms. Executives shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, avoiding his gaze, afraid that answering would draw his ire. The room had witnessed many things: firings, public humiliations, threats, but never a child. This intrusion was not just unusual, it was intolerable in Ethan's carefully controlled kingdom. Sophia, oblivious to the storm she'd walked into, tilted her head, her hazel eyes sweeping over the sea of suits and solemn faces. She spotted the untouched cups of black coffee, the polished portfolios stacked neatly, the way no one dared to breathe too loud. Then her gaze landed on Ethan Cole. For a long moment she studied him as only a child can, without fear, without filter, without the weight of knowing who he was. Her lips curled into a small, genuine smile. "I," she said softly, her voice carrying with a clarity that seemed to linger in the air long after the word had been spoken. The room froze. No one spoke. No one moved. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his silver hair catching the sunlight like strands of steel. His piercing blue eyes bore into Sophia, expecting her to shrink back, to retreat like every adult who had ever stood before him. But Sophia did not flinch. Instead, she walked closer, her tiny fingers brushing against the polished table as though she belonged there. "Papa," she whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Why do they all look so sad?" Lucas's throat burned. His eyes welled against his will. The words, innocent and uncalculated, had pierced deeper than any argument he could have offered. Executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the truth in the child's question heavier than the numbers in their reports. Ethan's jaw tightened, but for the first time, his gaze flickered, not in dominance, but in something almost imperceptible, something unsettled. Sophia turned her gaze back to the CEO, her head tilting slightly, as if she were inspecting not a man, but a puzzle. "Are you the boss?" she asked, her tone unthreatening, curious, filled with the disarming innocence of a child who still believed in kindness. The room collectively held its breath. Ethan Cole, a man feared by hundreds, a man who bent entire markets to his will, now faced a question he had never truly considered, not from shareholders, not from rivals, but from an 8-year-old girl in a lilac dress. Ethan straightened his posture, his lips parting as if to unleash the cold reply everyone expected. But before he could speak, Sophia continued, her voice soft, steady, unshaken. "If you're the boss, does that mean you make people cry?" The silence that followed was unlike any silence the boardroom had ever known. Not heavy with fear, not buzzing with anticipation, but aching, raw, undeniable. And in that silence, Ethan Cole, for the first time in years, found himself without words. Ethan Cole had been challenged many times before, by rivals in hostile takeovers, by shareholders questioning his decisions, even by politicians who sought to regulate his empire. In every case, he had emerged victorious, his words like iron, his will unbending, but never had a question so simple, so innocent, pierced through the fortress of his authority. "If you're the boss, does that mean you make people cry?" The words echoed in his mind, bouncing off walls he had built over decades, walls of pride, control, and calculated detachment. For the first time in years, Ethan hesitated. His hand, which usually rested steady and commanding on the polished cedar table, twitched ever so slightly, the Mont Blanc pen slipping between his fingers. Executives noticed. Lucas noticed. Most importantly, Sophia noticed. Children had a way of sensing cracks in facades adults couldn't see. She tilted her head, waiting for his answer, her wide hazel eyes refusing to release him from the spotlight. The room felt smaller, tighter, as though the very glass walls leaned inward, demanding his response. Lucas's heart pounded. He wanted to stand, to scoop Sophia into his arms and run before Ethan's wrath descended, but something inside him told him to wait. This moment felt divine, as if heaven itself had orchestrated Sophia's words to pierce through a man untouchable by every other weapon. Lucas could only sit frozen, breath shallow, watching the scene unfold with equal parts terror and awe. Ethan finally leaned back in his chair, his silver hair catching the sunlight, his face hardening again into the mask he wore so well. His voice, when it came, was low and deliberate. "Little girl, the world is not about crying, it's about winning. Weakness is punished, strength is rewarded. That is how the world works." His words cut with their usual precision, yet something in them trembled, like a note played slightly off-key. Sophia's small brow furrowed. She glanced around the room, her gaze lingering on the men in their pressed suits, their eyes cast down, their shoulders heavy. She pointed with the simplicity only a child could dare. "But they all look sad. If winning makes people sad, is it really winning?" Her voice was soft, but in the stillness of the boardroom it landed like thunder. The words slipped past the armor Ethan had built, cutting deeper than quarterly reports, profits, or losses ever could. The silence that followed was unbearable. A few executives shifted uncomfortably, one even pressing a hand to his mouth as if to hide the sting of tears. Lucas blinked hard, the edges of his vision blurring. He had never heard such wisdom from his daughter's lips, yet he knew these weren't rehearsed words. This was innocence speaking truth, a truth adults had long buried under ambition and fear. Ethan inhaled slowly, trying to steady the storm inside. No child, no one, had ever spoken to him this way. He felt the weight of every eye in the room, waiting, watching, silently begging for something to change. His jaw clenched, his pride screaming to reassert control, to remind them all who he was. He opened his mouth, ready to crush the moment with his usual sharpness. But then Sophia did something that no one expected. She walked right up to Ethan Cole, her small hands resting on the edge of the massive cedar table, her eyes looking straight into his. And with a voice so pure it carried no agenda, she asked, "Do you have someone who calls you Papa?" The question, innocent yet piercing, slammed into Ethan's chest like a blow he hadn't prepared for. His eyes flickered, just for a second, betraying a memory, a shadow, something buried deep within. The room held its breath. The question lingered in the air like the faint echo of a bell. "Do you have someone who calls you Papa?" Ethan Cole had silenced boardrooms, commanded markets, crushed rivals, but he had no defense against those words. His polished exterior, steel eyes, perfect suit, sculpted authority, shook under the weight of something he had not felt in years: memory. For a moment the boardroom disappeared. The glass walls blurred, the scent of cedar and leather dissolved, and Ethan was transported back decades, back to a hospital room where a tiny hand had once wrapped around his finger, back to a voice, small and full of trust, that had once called him Daddy. He had buried those moments beneath years of ambition, trading bedtime stories for late-night mergers, school plays for stock exchanges. The child who once looked at him with adoration no longer spoke to him. The silence between them had grown into a canyon too wide to cross. He blinked hard, forcing the memory away. He could not afford weakness. Not here. Not in front of subordinates who measured him by dominance. He cleared his throat, straightened his tie, and leaned forward, regaining his composure. "Little girl," he said slowly, his voice struggling for its usual authority. "This is not the place for such questions." But Sophia didn't move. Her small hands stayed on the polished cedar, her hazel eyes holding his with unflinching innocence. "It feels sad here," she whispered, like everyone forgot how to smile. The room shifted again, executives avoiding eye contact, some pressing their lips together to keep emotions from spilling out. The words of a child had stripped the boardroom of its armor more effectively than any corporate rival ever could. Lucas sat frozen, his heart torn between pride and fear. Pride that his daughter's presence carried such light, fear that her boldness might cost him his job, or worse. He prayed silently, his lips moving without sound, asking God to shield her, to turn this moment into something greater than humiliation. For years, Lucas had endured Ethan's iron hand, but now he sensed something different, like the first crack in a dam about to burst. Ethan leaned back, but his eyes betrayed him. A flicker of something human, pain, perhaps even regret, passed over his face before the mask returned. "Life is not about smiles," he muttered almost to himself. "It's about survival." His words were meant to close the matter, to re-establish dominance. But the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Everyone heard it. Everyone felt it. Sophia tilted her head again, her chestnut hair falling gently across her shoulder. "But if surviving makes you lonely," she said softly, "then maybe it isn't living." The words, so simple, so uncalculated, pierced through the marble floor, the cedar table, and landed straight in Ethan Cole's chest. For a moment his breath caught, his composure faltered, and his eyes glistened with something he had long forbidden himself to feel. The room was utterly still. No pen scratched across paper, no chair creaked. Every soul present knew they were witnessing something sacred, an unmasking of a man who had built an empire but lost himself along the way. Ethan opened his mouth, ready to lash back, to reassert control, but his throat tightened, and for the first time in his reign as CEO, he could not speak. His lips parted, but no sound came, only silence. And in that silence, Sophia leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper, yet clear enough to reach every corner of the room. "Do you ever feel like God misses you?" The question landed not just on Ethan, but on every soul seated around the table. A holy weight filled the air, the kind that made even the most hardened hearts tremble. Ethan's hand trembled against the polished cedar. His mask, though still clinging, was breaking. The boardroom had become a cathedral of silence. No one dared to breathe too loudly after Sophia's words had fallen like a whisper from heaven. "Do you ever feel like God misses you?" For men trained to analyze markets and memorize numbers, the weight of that single question was unbearable. It was as if the glass walls of the 45th floor were now windows to their own souls, reflecting back not profit margins, but emptiness. Ethan Cole sat rigid in his leather chair, his hand gripping the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white. He was not a man given to trembling, yet now every fiber of his being felt exposed. The memory of a child's laughter, a laughter that once belonged to his own daughter, rose uninvited in his mind. He remembered the way her tiny arms wrapped around his neck, the scent of baby powder, the way she called him Daddy in a voice he could never forget. That memory, once buried under layers of ambition and iron will, surged to the surface, and for a moment his blue eyes lost their steel. The executives shifted in their chairs, sensing the storm. They had seen Ethan humiliate grown men, break spirits, and dismiss lives with a flick of his hand. But now, before their eyes, they saw a man unraveling. Pride fought within him like a beast cornered, demanding he strike back, reclaim control, silence the child before his empire saw his weakness. Yet another voice, quieter, older, almost forgotten, whispered from deep within, "Is this what you became? Is this all that remains of you?" Lucas's chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. He could feel the atmosphere change, as though invisible hands had torn through the polished air of power and replaced it with something raw, something holy. His heart broke for Ethan, even as fear clawed at him. This moment was sacred, but it was also dangerous. He prayed silently, pleading with God, "Do something here, don't let him close his heart again." Sophia stood still, unafraid, her small fingers tracing the grain of the cedar table. Her eyes never left Ethan's. "I think God misses you," she said softly, as if she was simply stating a fact, not realizing she was shaking the foundation of a kingdom built on pride. The words cut deeper than any corporate betrayal Ethan had ever endured. His chest tightened, his throat burned. For years he had silenced that part of himself, convincing his soul that God was irrelevant, that money, power, and success were all the gods he needed. And yet, here was a child, an 8-year-old he didn't even know, dismantling his empire with a single sentence. Suddenly, Ethan pushed back his chair. The sound of leather scraping against marble startled everyone. The room froze. His towering frame stood, casting a long shadow across the table, his presence still commanding but no longer unshakable. His lips parted, but no words came. His chest heaved once, twice, as if wrestling with invisible chains. Then, without a word, he turned away from the table. The executives gasped softly as Ethan walked toward the tall glass windows. The city stretched below him, yellow taxis like ants, skyscrapers gleaming like spears of ambition, life pulsing endlessly. He pressed his palm against the cool glass, his reflection staring back at him. But the reflection did not look like a conqueror. It looked like a man, lonely, weary, and hollow. The silence in the boardroom was deafening. Lucas clutched his knees, unsure whether to rise, unsure whether his career had just ended. Sophia's gaze followed Ethan, her small face full of compassion, not judgment. To her, he wasn't the millionaire CEO or the man who had humiliated her father. He was simply another soul who looked lost. Ethan exhaled sharply, turning back to face the room. His eyes, though still piercing, now carried something different, something raw. The mask had slipped, if only for a moment. The room waited for his fury, the words that would restore his dominance. But instead, Ethan's voice came low, almost broken. "Meeting's over." Gasps rippled across the table. Executives exchanged confused glances. Ethan Cole had never dismissed a meeting without the final word, without the crushing blow, without victory. Yet now, he walked past them, his footsteps heavy, his face unreadable. He reached the door, placed his hand on the brass handle, and paused. His shoulders rose as if weighed by unseen burdens, and then, without turning, he whispered, so faintly that only those closest heard it, "I used to be called Daddy once." He opened the door and walked out, leaving the room in stunned silence. The heavy door to Ethan Cole's private office shut behind him with a dull thud, sealing him in a sanctuary of wealth that now felt like a prison. The space was immaculate, Walls lined with dark walnut shelves filled with leather-bound volumes he never read, a desk of polished black oak that gleamed like a mirror, and floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of Manhattan's skyline. Down below, the city roared with life, yellow taxis darting between lanes, steam rising from grates, millions of people in motion. Yet up here, silence reigned, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioner. Ethan stood motionless for a long moment, staring at his reflection in the glass. He saw the crisp lines of his navy suit, the silver sheen of his perfectly styled hair, the commanding posture he had cultivated for decades. But beneath it all, he saw something else. A man hollowed out, eyes that no longer glowed with ambition, but sagged with exhaustion. A face that looked older than its years, not from time, but from loneliness. Sophia's words looped in his mind like a melody he couldn't silence. "I think God misses you." He clenched his jaw, trying to shake it off, but the phrase sank deeper with every passing second. God. The very word tasted foreign on his tongue, like a language he had once known but forgotten. He remembered Sundays long ago, when he was a boy sitting beside his mother in a wooden pew, sunlight streaming through stained glass, hymns swelling like waves. Back then, he had believed God saw him, loved him, but that was before success, before betrayal, before he had decided that power was safer than trust. His chest rose and fell unevenly. He moved toward his desk, his footsteps muffled against the Persian rug, and reached for the crystal decanter. Inside, amber liquid shimmered under the afternoon light. His hand trembled as he poured it into a glass. He raised it halfway, then stopped. The scent of oak and smoke rose to his nose, but he set the glass down abruptly, liquid sloshing onto the desk. For once, he couldn't drown what he felt. He gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles whitening, and bowed his head. Memories came uninvited. His daughter at 5 years old, standing at the edge of a soccer field, waving proudly when she spotted him. His daughter at 7, holding a handmade card that said, "Best daddy ever." His daughter at 10, her eyes filled with hurt when he missed yet another recital. The last time she had called him daddy was more than a decade ago. After that, she stopped waiting. She stopped asking. She stopped calling altogether. The weight of regret pressed against his chest until he could barely breathe. For years, he had told himself it was necessary. Sacrifices had to be made. Families could wait. Success demanded everything. But now, alone in this office of glass and marble, with silence pressing in on him, he realized he had built an empire and lost the only thing that truly mattered. Meanwhile, just a few doors away, Lucas sat with Sophia in a smaller waiting room. His heart pounded, fear clawing at him. "Sophia, you shouldn't have come in like that," he whispered, his voice strained. "Mr. Cole could fire me for this. Do you understand?" But Sophia only tilted her head, her hazel eyes shimmering with compassion. "Papa," she said softly, "he looked sadder than you." The words pierced Lucas's heart. Was it possible that beneath Ethan's cruelty there was sadness deeper than his own? Back in his office, Ethan lowered himself into the leather chair, the weight of his body sinking as if gravity itself had grown stronger. His gaze drifted to the telephone on his desk. Slowly, he reached for it, his fingers trembling as he scrolled through old contacts. And there it was, a number he hadn't dialed in years. His daughter's. His breath caught in his throat. The cursor hovered over the green button. One tap, and her voice might flood back into his life. But what if she refused to answer? What if she hated him? What if it was too late? He closed his eyes, his finger hovering over the button. For a heartbeat, he could almost hear her laughter, almost smell the baby powder from years ago, almost feel her tiny arms around his neck. His heart raced, his pulse thundering in his ears. But fear won. His hand dropped. The phone clattered back into its cradle. The silence in the office deepened, heavy, suffocating. Ethan pressed his palms against his face, his breath ragged. For decades, he had conquered everything before him, markets, rivals, enemies. But here, alone with his regrets, he was utterly defeated. His voice, cracked and low, slipped into the room like a confession he hadn't meant to speak aloud. What if God really does miss me? The boardroom felt like a storm had passed through it. The air was heavy, charged, as if invisible currents of tension and grace collided in the space between glass walls and cedar wood. The executives sat stiff in their leather chairs, exchanging uneasy glances, but saying nothing. Ethan Cole had left the room a man unshakable, but when he returned minutes later there was something fractured in him. His stride was slower, his shoulders slightly bowed, his eyes carrying shadows no suit could disguise. Lucas's stomach knotted as he saw Ethan re-enter. He reached instinctively for Sophia's hand, hoping to keep her quiet, but it was too late. She sensed something no one else dared to acknowledge. She saw not the ruthless CEO, but a man wounded, heavy with loneliness. Her hazel eyes shimmered with compassion, and before Lucas could stop her, she slipped free of his grasp and stepped toward the center of the room. The soft tap of her shoes echoed like drum beats. Executives shifted uncomfortably, not knowing whether to watch or look away. Ethan's gaze fell on her, and for a moment his mask tried to return. His eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched. But it was fragile now, a wall already cracked. Sophia stood in the middle of the boardroom, her lilac dress glowing under the shafts of afternoon light. She clasped her small hands together, tilted her head toward the ceiling, and spoke words no one expected. God, please make him happy again. Please remind him he's not alone. Her voice was simple, unpolished, childlike, but it carried weight, piercing through decades of pride, ambition, and silence. The words floated into every corner of the boardroom, settling on the hearts of men who had long forgotten what it felt like to be seen beyond their productivity. One executive bit his lip, blinking rapidly to hide the tears threatening to fall. Another bowed his head, his chest rising and falling as if something inside had broken loose. Lucas's throat tightened, his eyes burning as peace washed over him in waves he couldn't explain. This was no ordinary moment. This was holy ground. Ethan stood frozen. His mind screamed to dismiss it, to wave it off as nonsense, but his heart betrayed him. Each word Sophia spoke struck chords he thought long silenced. Happy again, not alone. The phrases replayed in his mind, colliding with memories of a younger man who once believed life could be more than profit margins. A man who once held a daughter in his arms and thought love was enough. A single tear welled in the corner of his eye. He blinked furiously, fighting it back. Ethan Cole did not cry, not in public, not in private, not ever. And yet, despite every ounce of willpower, the tear slipped down his cheek, glistening as it caught the light. Gasps rippled quietly around the table. The unbreakable man was breaking, right before their eyes. Sophia's prayer ended as simply as it had begun. She opened her eyes, looked at Ethan, and smiled. A smile free of judgment, full only of hope. "See," she said softly, "God listens." The words landed like a final arrow in Ethan's chest. He pressed a trembling hand to the table for support. His empire, his power, his carefully built fortress, all of it crumbled in that moment. He had conquered everything but his own emptiness. And now, an 8-year-old child had done what no rival, no loss, no failure ever could. She had exposed his heart. Silence reigned again, but it was different this time. Not oppressive, not cold. It was tender, sacred, as if heaven itself had bent low to listen. Ethan swallowed hard, his voice breaking for the first time in decades. He began, his throat tight, his words trembling. "I don't know how to pray anymore." The confession stunned the room. Executives leaned forward, Lucas's breath caught, and Sophia's hazel eyes lit up with a warmth that only innocence could carry. Ethan Cole, the man who silenced nations with his authority, had admitted the deepest truth of all. He was lost. The confession lingered in the air like a fragile glass ornament. "I don't know how to pray anymore." For a man who had built walls higher than his towers of glass, the words felt like watching stone crumble under its own weight. The boardroom once a battlefield of numbers and pride, had become something entirely different, a sanctuary. No one dared to move, as if even a whisper could shatter the sacredness of the moment. Lucas's eyes burned with tears he could no longer hide. For years, he had prayed for deliverance from humiliation, from the crushing weight of a boss who ruled without mercy. But never in his wildest dreams had he imagined this, that his daughter's small voice would bring the mighty to his knees. He squeezed Sophia's hand, his heart swelling with gratitude and awe. Sophia, unbothered by the stunned silence, stepped closer to Ethan, her hazel eyes wide and sincere, locked on his. "It's okay," she whispered gently. "You don't have to know how. You can just talk to him." Her words were not theological, not rehearsed, but pure, like a key fitting into a lock Ethan had forgotten he had. Something inside Ethan broke wide open. Decades of suppressed grief, anger, and regret came flooding to the surface. His hand rose to his face, covering his eyes as sobs he hadn't felt since boyhood tore through him. His broad shoulders shook, his breath ragged. Executives looked on in shock, some weeping quietly themselves. The image of their untouchable leader crumbling before a child was more than they could bear. It was a revelation. For minutes Ethan wept. No speeches, no defenses, no masks. Just raw, unfiltered sorrow. And in that brokenness, a flicker of something new began to rise. Not shame, but hope. When his sobs finally quieted, he lowered his hand and looked at Sophia, his blue eyes swollen and red. Would you pray with me?" he asked, his voice fragile, unfamiliar. Sophia's face lit up with a smile so radiant it softened the entire room. She nodded eagerly and placed her small hand in his. Lucas joined, trembling, unable to believe what he was witnessing. The circle was strange. An untouchable CEO, a weary employee, and an 8-year-old girl. But heaven recognized it as holy. Sophia bowed her head. "God," she said simply, "thank you for listening. Please help him not feel alone anymore. And please, remind him you love him." The words were unadorned, childlike, yet they rang with eternal truth. Ethan squeezed her hand, a sob breaking loose again as the prayer soaked into the deepest cracks of his soul. When she finished, silence filled the room once more. But this silence was different, light, peaceful, alive. Ethan lifted his head, his tear-stained face no longer carrying the mask of a conqueror, but the humility of a man rediscovering what it meant to be human. For the first time in decades, he smiled. It was small, almost uncertain, but real. He looked at Lucas, his voice hoarse. "I was wrong about you, about all of this. I thought power was everything, but your daughter reminded me what I lost." His gaze shifted back to Sophia, and his voice cracked. "And maybe what I can find again." The room, filled with men who had long bowed to his authority, now witnessed something far greater than power. Redemption. Weeks later, stories spread quietly through the company. The once merciless CEO had softened. Meetings no longer ended in humiliation, but in collaboration. Employees walked into the tower with lighter hearts, and though not everyone knew the full story, they knew something had changed. As for Ethan Cole, the journey was far from over. Rebuilding bridges with his own daughter would take time. Learning to pray again would be a slow, stumbling process. But for the first time in years, he wanted to try. Because sometimes it takes the innocence of a child to remind even the strongest that God still whispers, "I miss you," and a little child shall lead them. Isaiah 11:6. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to subscribe for more journeys of faith and redemption. And tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from?